Oh, hello there. Happy Sunday to you. My name is Chelsea Seaburn. Welcome to the Smart Student channel, where today I want to talk about how to cite and reference books. I'm talking hardcover books, audio books, books with authors, books without authors, books with edited chapters, aka your textbooks. If that sounds good to you, you're in the right place. And by the way, keep in mind that this video is time-stamped. We're gonna go over a lot of examples. So if you're someone who knows the exact example that you wanna watch, be sure to use those timestamps to your advantage. But for everyone else who would like to have some fun, perhaps, let's go ahead and get started. Oh, there you guys are. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is quickly refresh on the 4 elements that every single reference list entry is made up of, including books. So those 4 elements would be the author, the year of publication, the title, and the source. So no matter what type of book you're trying to cite, it's important that you remember that you're looking for those 4 elements. Now, let's go ahead and jump into my computer where I'm going to walk you through examples. And just so you know, what I'm going to do is cover the template first, and then we're going to fill in the information for the actual example. By the way, if you want to download what I'm showing you on my screen, there will be a link in the description below. Okay, let's go. All right, so here we are. Like I said, we're going to talk about the template first, and then we're going to fill it in with this material, or at least I'm going to explain why the material is where it's at. Now, the first thing I'd like you to note is that the template is color-coded. So blue is going to represent the author element, pink is going to go for the date, green will be the title, and purple will represent the source element. And starting with these 2 examples, I wanted to group a book and a book-specific edition together because if you'll notice, the templates are almost identical. The only difference is that if you're referencing a book that is a specific edition, well, you need to include the edition. Now, the last thing I'd like to note before we jump into this example is that underneath each of these reference list entries are going to be the corresponding in-text citation. The first in-text citation is going to be for paraphrased material, while the second one will be if you directly quote the source. So in other words, a direct quote is where you keep the words verbatim, which is why you see the source locator here, which for a book is going to be a page number. But let's go ahead and jump into this first example. So you're going to start with the author's last name, followed by their first initial and a period, as well as their middle initial if you can find it. Now, for the date element, all APA requires is the year of publication because quite frankly, books don't include the publication date down to the month and the day. Usually only the year is available, which is why it's acceptable here. Next, you have the title, which in this case is going to be the title of the book. Please note how its font is italicized. This is because books are considered works that stand alone, therefore they follow the APA italicized title formatting pattern. These 2 examples next to each other are actually great because there's something else I'd like to note about the title element. So if you'll notice, for this first example, the title is included in capitalized font. In other words, it's in title cased where all the major words are capitalized. Whereas in the second example, it's using sentence case, where only the first word is capitalized, including the subtitle, which is included the same way. The reason is because for a book, APA would like you to include the title as it is on the book. It's as simple as that. But moving on to the final element in these reference list entries, which is going to be the source element. And if you'll note, there is no ask for a DOI or a URL. This is because if you're reading a hardcover book, well, you don't have one of those. That's why the publishing company is all you need for the source element. But that's it for these first 2 examples. Again, please take one more note how the only difference is that if you are referencing a specific edition, you need to include the edition just as you see it is here, where you would include the number, followed by ED, the abbreviation for the word edition, followed by a period, a parenthesis, and then one more period to close out the title element. But now let's go ahead and talk about an audiobook. And by the way, here are the in-text citations for the specific edition. They are exactly the same as the previous example. But let's go ahead and go down to the audiobook now. So the audiobook has a few different moving parts, but again, it's very similar to the previous examples. By the way, you're going to hear me say similar quite a bit because I want you guys to get into the right mindset of, while this stuff looks complicated, once you understand how it works, it's simple and it's all very similar. The first thing I'd like to do is point out the differences in the template. Starting with the title of the book. If you'll notice, it asks for the narrator information. So you're going to start with the first initial, the full last name, and then the abbreviation NARR period, signifying that this person is the narrator of the audiobook. Lastly, to finish up the title element, you're going to include the word audiobook in square brackets like you see it is here. Otherwise, the only other difference is that in this case, you can provide a URL, because if it's an audiobook, there is a good chance you found it online. Now, I will say that there are scenarios where the URL is not available. Let's say you're using an app to download and read your book. In that case, you probably don't have a URL, in which it's okay to omit it. Now, let's go ahead and talk about the example, because this is a great example of something really important that you may run into. So first things first, the author element looks just as before. But note how the year of publication says 2015, where in the example above for this same book, it's 1997. The reason is, when you're referencing an audiobook, you want to put the year of publication, meaning the year the audiobook was published, not when the original book was published. So furthermore, at the end of your citation, if the work you're citing was originally published on a previous date, you would include it at the end like this. This is actually a rule of thumb no matter what type of source you're citing. And for your understanding, I have another demonstration down below that's going to show you this again. But for now, the year of publication for an audiobook, you're going to include the year the audiobook was published, and then at the end, you can include the year that the actual book was published. But moving on to the title element. As you can see, the title is included just as before in italicized font. Here, we have the narrator information matching the template as I discussed before. We have audiobook in those square brackets and the period closing out the title element of this entry. Now, moving on to the source, we have the same publishing company. This one does have a URL, which you could click and go to this audiobook. And then again, this is just signifying that this audiobook, the real hard book, was published in a different year. The reason this example is important is because the in-text citations are a little different from a traditional in-text citation. If you have 2 years in your reference list entry, you need to signify that. So if you'll notice, we have the author's last name, followed by the year the audiobook was published, / the year the book was published. And then for the direct quote example, everything stays the same except we have the source locator of where we're quoting the book. But that wraps up the audiobook. Let's move on to the next example. And I want to change directions a little bit. We're going to start talking about edited books. So an edited book is very common if you're trying to reference, say, your textbook. Oftentimes, mostly every time actually, textbooks are edited time and time again. You have multiple authors, multiple editors. And so let's talk about this. Now, here's that same phrase again, but I want you to look at this template because it's very similar to what we just saw. But let's go ahead and break down the example because I have a few good points to make here. Okay, so the author element is just as before. Please note how there's no middle initial. That's simply because the middle name wasn't given. That's fine, simply omit it. Next, you have the year of publication, which is 2017. Now, this is referring to the year that the edited book was published. So if you'll note, we have another one of those second date elements because this book was originally published at another date. And I mean, that kind of makes sense here because if the book was edited, well, the first time it was published would be considered the original work. And quite frankly, this one dates back a long time ago. So I just want to point that out. We'll address these in the in-text citation in just a second. Let's move on with the rest of the reference list entry. So here we have the title of the book, again in the italicized font. Next, we have the editor's information. You have their first initials, followed by their full last name, a comma, and then the abbreviation ED period, signifying that this person is the editor. And this one actually makes a really good point because please note how there's 3 initials before the last name. That's simply because this editor had 2 middle names. So just as it's okay to leave out the middle name if it's not included, well, if they have more than one, you want to include all of them. But that closes out the title element right here. Moving on to the source, we have the publisher, and then there was no DOI available for this edited book. It's all right, we simply leave it out. But now, moving down to those in-text citations, just as we did before, you're going to apply the same principle. You have the year the edited book was published, and then the year the original book was published. And please note how there's a date range for the original work published element. Well, you're going to include that date range for the in-text citation as well. And then if this were a direct quote, you have this source locator just as you would include it before. But let's move on to the next example. I believe we have 2 more left, so stick with me, you are a champ. And I actually want to show these ones side by side because now we're going to talk about how to reference an edited book with no author. So this is simply where the editors are listed instead of the author, which is actually fairly common with textbooks and edited books, so you may run into this. So let's look at the template first. Basically, what happens in this second scenario is the editor element moves to the front where the author element would be. And then there simply is no author element since we're referencing an edited book with no author. Simple enough, right? Okay, now let's go ahead and look at the example. So we have the editor just as you would have included it before. You have the year of publication, which is 2017. Now, if you're sitting there wondering, well, why is there no original work published date like this one had? It's an edited book, right? Well, it's simply because it was not offered on this example. I couldn't find it, therefore it's okay to omit it if it's not available. Moving on to the title of the book, as you can see, here we are right here with that same italicized font, finishing out the element with a period. Then we have the publisher. And in this example, we do have a DOI, therefore we're going to include it. And then finally, you have the in-text citation for paraphrase material and an in-text citation for a direct quote. But all right, we officially have one example left. And bear with me here, this one is going to look a little complicated because it is the most complex, but again, we're going to follow those same principles we've been talking about this whole time. And so we're going to talk about what to do if you want to reference a chapter from an edited book. So here we go. Let's talk about the template first. We have the author, just as normal. You have the year of publication. Then we want to include the title of the chapter with the editor first before we include the title of the book. And then note how for this reference list entry, you also need to include the pages associated with that chapter. So in other words, the only real differences come in the title element. The other 3 are, well, the exact same. So let's break this down with the example because examples are the best way to learn. I truly believe that. Okay, so we have the author here. Perfect. Next, we have the year of publication, which is 1988. I'm going to point out again that this example did not have an original work published date available, which is why it's not included here. Now, let's talk about the title element. So as you can see here, this is the title of the chapter. Let me highlight it so you can see. Oops, that's going to be, here we go. All right. This is the title of the chapter. Please note how it's not in italicized font. Also, please note how there's a period after the chapter element where typically you want to include the punctuation after the full title element. In this case, you're going to include a period after the chapter, signifying that it's the end of the chapter. The reason being is that note how for the editor element, there is the word in before the actual editor. You want to separate those two, and that's what the period does. So you're going to type out the word in, the editor's name, and again, the ed information just as you would previously. You're going to separate this with a comma before you include the title of the book, now in italicized font, and then we have the page range right here. Since it's a page range, please note how there's 2 P's included instead of 1 P when there's a single page. And of course, we do have that final period closing out the full title element. That was a lot, but again, it's not too bad once you understand what you're doing. So I hope that was helpful. But finally, you have the publisher and the DOI if available. And in this example, there was no DOI, so it's okay to omit it. Finally, you have the in-text citations down here. You have the first one for the paraphrase material and the second one for a direct quote. But congratulations, guys, because that finishes out this tutorial. I just want you to see what we looked at from a bird's eye view. And here we go. So we have the various scenarios of different books that you may run into referencing for APA formatting. And again, this template is going to be linked down in the description below. I highly recommend downloading it, saving it on your computer, so you can have these templates and examples at the very least. This is going to come in handy when you actually apply these methods. Well, I hope you found that tutorial helpful and useful and you found the exact information that you need. Thank you so much for watching this video all the way through. Be sure to give it a big thumbs up, and well, I guess there's only one thing left to do. I'll see you guys later.